A ruthless real estate mogul married a woman of grace and brilliance, then made the worst mistake of his life. When their marriage crumbled, he laughed, thinking his billions could buy justice. But she walked into that courtroom alone, armed with nothing but the truth. What happened next will make you believe in karma again. Let me take you back 15 years. There's a man named Vincent Ashford, 58 years old, owner of one of the largest commercial real estate empires in the country. We're talking shopping centers, office buildings, industrial complexes across 3 continents. When Vincent walks into a room, people don't see a person. They see a walking bank account. They see power. They see someone who has already won at life. But here's what nobody talks about. There's a difference between being successful and being good. Vincent had mastered success. He had a penthouse that looked like it belonged in a magazine. He had a vintage car collection that made grown men weep. He had restaurants that would hold his table at a moment's notice. He had everything except something real. That changed at a charity gala in the spring of 2009. Grace Chen walked into that event with an architect's eye and a heart that hadn't yet learned the cost of ambition. She was 35, brilliant, independent, running her own small architectural practice, designing sustainable buildings for modest clients who couldn't afford the big firms. She wasn't looking for Vincent. In fact, she barely noticed him at first. But Vincent noticed her. He noticed that she laughed without checking the room to see if it was appropriate. He noticed that she talked about passion with the kind of intensity that most people save for expensive things. He noticed that she didn't care that he was rich, or at least she pretended not to, which was close enough for someone like Vincent. He pursued her with the same single-minded determination he'd used to build his empire: expensive dinners, thoughtful gestures. He learned about architecture just so he could have conversations with her. He became the man she wanted to see. And because Grace was kind and hopeful, she let herself believe that this version of Vincent was real. They got married 3 years later. For the first few years, it seemed perfect. She designed buildings. He expanded his empire. They attended galas together. They had matching business cards in their designer wallets. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, something shifted. Vincent began to suggest that Grace's work wasn't as important as it used to be. He'd mention, in that casual way powerful people have, that she didn't need to work anymore, that she could focus on being his wife, on managing their homes, on being present at his events. Grace tried to resist at first. She loved her work, but Vincent was relentless in a different way now. He'd make comments about clients calling him instead of her. He'd mention that his partners had wives who didn't work. He'd ask, with genuine confusion, why she wasn't happy just being with him. He didn't yell. He didn't have to. He had something more effective than anger. He had the power of someone who believed he was right. Slowly, over years, Grace closed her practice. She told herself it was temporary. She told herself that being married to Vincent meant something. It meant security, meant partnership, meant she was building something bigger than her own career. But what she was really building was a prison made of silence and compromise. The infidelities started in year 5. At first, they were rumors, whispered conversations at parties that would stop when Grace walked by. A woman in an expensive dress who looked too familiar on his arm at a business conference, emails on his phone that he'd delete too quickly. Grace asked him about them once quietly in the privacy of their bedroom. He laughed. And this is important, because that laugh would change everything. He laughed like she'd said something naive and adorable, like she was a child concerned about imaginary monsters. "Darling," he said, "you're my wife. That's different. Don't embarrass yourself by being insecure." She never asked again. Instead, she buried herself deeper into managing his life, his homes, his image. She became the woman who made sure his world ran perfectly while he lived in another one entirely. 10 years into their marriage, Grace discovered something. She was looking for a document in his home office, something mundane, probably his insurance paperwork, when she found a folder he'd hidden behind a false panel in his desk. Inside were documents for an offshore account, multiple accounts actually. She sat there for what felt like hours, reading numbers that didn't make sense, understanding slowly that he was hiding more money than most people would make in 100 lifetimes. Her hands were shaking. Not from anger yet, but from the realization that everything she'd suspected, everything she'd let herself believe wasn't true, was actually worse than she'd feared. He wasn't just unfaithful, he was planning something. The offshore accounts weren't about hiding from taxes, though there was that too. They were about hiding from her. That night she confronted him. She was calm, actually, almost eerily calm. She laid the documents on his desk and asked him directly, "What is this? Why are you hiding this?" And he laughed. The same laugh as before, but this time it was different. This time it sounded like contempt. "Grace," he said, shaking his head like she'd disappointed him in a fundamental way, "you're a housewife. You don't understand business. You don't understand how the world works. These are my assets from before we married being properly managed. What could you possibly do with this information? You can't even run your own career." That's when something broke inside her, not in a dramatic way. There were no tears, no screaming. It was quieter than that. It was the sound of hope finally accepting its own defeat. It was the moment she stopped believing in the story she'd been telling herself about their life together. The next morning, while Vincent was at his office, Grace made a phone call to a divorce lawyer. Her voice was steady. Her decision was absolute. Here's where the twist begins to reveal itself. Vincent's response was immediate and brutal. He hired a team of divorce attorneys. I'm talking 6 lawyers from the most prestigious firm in the city. He called in favors from judges and politicians. He had PR people leak stories to business magazines about how Grace was leaving him for financial gain, about how she was ungrateful, about how she'd never contributed anything to his success. The narrative in their social circles shifted overnight. Suddenly, Grace wasn't a wife who'd sacrificed her career. She was a gold digger playing victim. Vincent controlled the story because Vincent controlled everything: the media, the connections, the resources. Grace's first lawyer sat down with her and delivered the reality check. "Look," he said, not unkindly, "he has unlimited resources. We can fight, but he'll outspend us, outlawyer us, and outweight us. I'd recommend settling. Take what you can get and move on." The settlement he suggested would have given her maybe 15% of their marital assets. Everything she'd sacrificed for, everything she'd given up, would be worth that tiny fraction. Vincent's lawyers had already indicated they wouldn't accept anything higher. The judge would probably split the difference, they said. That's just how it works. Grace went home that night to her modest rental apartment. Vincent had kept the houses, naturally, and she sat in the dark. She thought about that laugh. She thought about 10 years of making herself smaller, quieter, less important. She thought about all the buildings she could have designed, all the spaces she could have created, all the dreams she'd let him convince her to abandon, and then she made a decision that changed everything. She'd spent those 10 years as Vincent's wife doing something he didn't know about. While he thought she was shopping and getting her nails done and attending his events, she was reading. Not novels, case law, legal precedent. She'd developed an obsession with understanding how the system worked, the same way she used to study architecture. She'd read hundreds of cases about divorce, about asset protection, about fraud. She'd filled notebooks with observations, questions, and strategies. She never intended to use this knowledge. It was just something her restless mind had done to stay sane. But now, sitting alone in her apartment, she understood that the universe had been preparing her. The next morning, she called her lawyer back and told him she would represent herself. He thought she was insane. He actually said those words, "You're insane." She wasn't offended. She simply smiled and thanked him for his time. In the weeks before the trial, Grace transformed. She wasn't just preparing a legal case, she was preparing to tell the truth in a language the system would have to respect. She gathered evidence that Vincent and his team didn't even know she had. The household staff, people Vincent had ignored for years, came forward voluntarily. They testified in her quiet living room about the infidelities, about the cruelty, about the nights Grace cried in the kitchen thinking no one could hear her. She documented every conversation with Vincent's business associates who'd let things slip over the years. She found communications between Vincent and his attorneys, discussing how to minimize what she'd receive. She obtained bank records that showed hidden transfers, payments to women who weren't his wife, offshore movements that suggested tax evasion on a spectacular scale. But more importantly, she studied the law until she could recite statute numbers in her sleep. She learned how to cross-examine a witness. She understood the rules of evidence better than many lawyers who'd been practicing for years. She prepared not just evidence but strategy, knowing that Vincent's attorneys would rely on their reputation and aggression, not on actual legal foundation. The night before the trial, Grace sat in her apartment and looked at herself in the mirror. She was terrified. But underneath the terror was something else: certainty. She knew Vincent better than anyone on earth knew him. She knew his patterns, his ego, his weakness, and she knew the truth. The courtroom was crowded the morning of the trial. Vincent's legal team had 12 people there: associates, paralegals, consultants. They wore tailored suits that cost more than Grace's entire wardrobe. They had leather portfolios and the kind of confidence that comes from knowing you've never lost a case. Vincent sat at their table with a look of bemused certainty. He kept glancing at Grace like he was watching a child attempt to do his taxes. When she walked to the defendant's table alone, he actually smirked. You could see it in his face. He'd already won. The judge, an older woman named Margaret Wu who'd been on the bench for 23 years, noticed that smirk. Vincent's lead attorney stood up and delivered their opening statement with practiced perfection. They painted a picture of a marriage where Vincent had been the sole provider, the breadwinner, the architect of their success. Grace, they argued, was a housewife who'd contributed nothing. She should be grateful for whatever support she received. The company that built this wealth belonged to Vincent. The marriage had merely existed alongside it. Then Grace stood. What happened next was something the courtroom wasn't expecting. She didn't sound like someone without a lawyer. She sounded like someone who understood not just the law, but the truth. She looked directly at Vincent and began to explain in clear, devastating detail how she had documentation of every hidden asset. "I have," she said calmly, "records of 3 offshore accounts opened without my knowledge. I have wire transfers totaling $47 million to locations in the Cayman Islands and Switzerland. I have communications between you and your accountant discussing how to structure these transfers to avoid detection. I have property transfers in your brother's name that never belonged to your brother. And I have financial records showing that you've been hiding income from business ventures conducted during our marriage." Vincent's attorneys were on their feet immediately. "Your Honor, she's making allegations without proper evidence." "I have the evidence," Grace said quietly. She held up a folder, then another, then a third. "And I'll be presenting all of it, starting with the documents I found in his office." The judge's expression hardened. She leaned forward. "How did you obtain these documents, Ms. Chen?" "They were in my marital home, Your Honor. Documents of marital assets. As a spouse, I had a right to see them." What Vincent and his attorneys hadn't anticipated was that Grace wasn't just fighting a divorce case. She was exposing potential fraud and tax evasion. Suddenly, the case became about something much bigger than spousal support. When Vincent took the stand, he was confident. He'd given depositions before. He was used to controlling conversations through the force of his personality and the authority of his wealth. Grace stood to cross-examine him, and that's when the real masterclass began. "Mr. Ashford," she said, "let's talk about the account in the Cayman Islands, the one you opened in 2016. Who authorized that account?" "That was before," he started. "Yes or no? Who authorized it?" "I authorized it." "And you didn't inform me, your spouse, about an account containing $12 million? His attorney objected. The judge overruled him. "It was my private account," Vincent said, his voice starting to harden. "Private," Grace repeated. "With marital funds. Funds earned during our marriage from your business. Funds we had agreed would be held jointly for family security. Funds that, according to state law, are community property and therefore my property as much as yours." She pulled out document after document. Every objection from Vincent's team was deflected by Grace's perfect understanding of precedent. She cited case numbers from memory. She understood the law in a way that suggested she'd been born to it. Mr. Ashford, did you tell your attorneys to instruct me that you would not be disclosing your full assets? I told them to manage my legal case. That's a yes? Not exactly. I have an email from you to your attorneys, dated March 2023. It says, "Tell Grace the split is 80-20, or we go to trial and she gets nothing. She doesn't have the resources to fight us." That's your email, isn't it? The courtroom was silent. Vincent's face was turning red. I was being strategic. You were committing fraud, Grace said simply. You were attempting to conceal marital assets and coerce me into accepting a settlement based on lies. That's not strategy, Mr. Ashford. That's a crime. When she sat down, the case had fundamentally shifted. But the real bombshell came when Grace called her surprise witness. His name was David Rutherford, and he was Vincent's best friend and business partner for 20 years. Nobody expected him to testify. His presence alone sent shockwaves through Vincent's legal team. They scrambled to file objections, but the judge allowed it. David was calm as he took the stand. He looked directly at Vincent, not with anger, but with something that looked like regret. "Vincent told me about the accounts," he said simply. "We were at his club having drinks, maybe 5 years ago. He was bragging about how he'd structured everything so that if his marriage fell apart, Grace would be left with nothing." Those were his words. "She'll have nothing, and I'll keep everything." He thought it was funny. Vincent's attorney was on his feet. "Your Honor, this is hearsay." "It's not hearsay," David continued, ignoring the objection, "because I've also brought his personal text messages to me where he discusses his affairs in detail, where he calls Grace disparaging names, where he states explicitly that he married her to have a trophy wife and now he's upgrading. These are his words. I have them all." The documents were entered into evidence. The courtroom felt like the walls were collapsing. When David left the stand, Vincent looked like a man who'd finally understood that the game was over. His attorneys were conferring frantically, but there was nothing left to do. The truth had been spoken in the language the system understood, and that truth was devastating. 3 weeks later, Judge Wu issued her ruling. She awarded Grace 65% of all marital assets. She ordered a full forensic audit of every account. She found that Vincent had committed fraud and advised him that he should prepare for potential criminal prosecution. She also ordered him to pay her legal fees, which was particularly humiliating because Grace hadn't had a lawyer. Vincent sat there while his entire empire was dismantled by the truth. The woman he'd laughed at had destroyed him not with money or power, but with preparation and integrity. His attorneys immediately started discussions about plea bargains and settlements with financial authorities. The billion-dollar empire suddenly had criminal exposure that no amount of money could completely solve. The thought of prison, not for decades but for years, became a real possibility. In the hallway after the verdict, Vincent looked at Grace. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't celebrating. She just looked at him the way you might look at something you used to love but can no longer recognize. She nodded once, with respect for the man she'd once believed in, and then she turned and walked away. She didn't need to gloat. She didn't need to scream about justice. The truth had already done that work for her. What happened next is where the real story becomes meaningful. Grace didn't spend her settlement on houses or cars. She used it to reopen her architectural practice, but differently. She started designing affordable housing. She created spaces for women's shelters. She designed community centers in neighborhoods that nobody wealthy wanted to invest in. She became the architect she'd always wanted to be, the one Vincent had convinced her to abandon. More importantly, she started mentoring young women. They'd come to her office, which was modest but filled with light and purpose, and she'd teach them not just about architecture, but about self-respect. She'd tell them her story not as a victim, but as a testimony to what becomes possible when you refuse to make yourself smaller for anyone. A year after the trial, she gave an interview for a podcast. The host asked her, "Do you believe in karma?" She thought for a moment, really considered the question. "I don't know if the universe has intention," she said, "but I know this. There's a law of consequences. When you lie to people, when you hide from the truth, when you disrespect the people who love you, Eventually, that catches up to you. Vincent didn't lose because I was clever. He lost because I chose to be honest, and honesty is more powerful than any amount of money. That interview went viral. Millions of people watched it. Women who'd been made small by powerful men reached out to her. They asked her how to fight back. She told them the same thing every time. Educate yourself, prepare yourself, and then tell the truth. That's all you ever really need. This story didn't make headlines like it should have. The business press was quiet about Vincent's fall because the system protects its own. But the truth is this: a woman with nothing but knowledge and integrity dismantled a billion-dollar fortune built on lies. Vincent served 3 years for tax evasion and fraud. When he got out, he was a different man, not redeemed exactly, but diminished. He'd lost his empire, his status, his certainty that money could fix anything. Grace built something better. She built a life that was actually meaningful. So if you're watching this, and if there's something in your life that feels unfair, if there's someone who's made you feel small or powerless, remember this: your greatest weapon isn't anger or violence or revenge. It's preparation. It's integrity. It's refusing to let anyone convince you that you deserve less than the truth. Hit that subscribe button right now. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment and tell me what you think. Do you believe in karma? Because I'm telling you, it doesn't matter what you believe. Karma believes in you. It believes in justice. It believes in the truth. And the truth always, always wins. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.